The winter of 1941 arrived earlier than anyone expected. By November, the flat lands stretching from Smolensk to Vyazma were buried beneath meters of snow. Temperatures plunged below -30 Celsius. The Wehrmacht's advance, once swift and unstoppable, had slowed to a crawl, and on airfields across the Eastern Front, a new enemy emerged. It wasn't the Red Army, it was the cold itself. At dawn, mechanics stood beside motionless aircraft. The Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Junkers Ju-87s that had ruled the skies refused to start. The engines were silent. Even the mighty Daimler-Benz DB601 shuddered and died after a few coughs of life. Crews thought it was sabotage, but the truth was simpler and more devastating. The fuel had turned to gel. Gasoline and aviation fuel, designed for mild European climates, thickened in the brutal Russian frost. The lighter fractions evaporated or froze. In some cases, entire fuel lines turned white with frost inside. Mechanics lit fires beneath engines, hoping to warm the metal, but often melted fuel pumps or ignited fumes. Every morning, a dozen planes were lost to accidental fires before they could even leave the ground. Oberfeldwebel Karl Heinz Kruger, a chief mechanic in JG-54, Grünherz, later wrote in his diary, "We were fighting a war inside a war. The Russians had winter, and we did not. Our fuel froze before we could reach them." Similar scenes unfolded in the armored divisions. The Panzer III and IV tanks, symbols of German power, became useless hulks overnight. Diesel congealed in their lines, batteries drained in the cold, crews burned logs under the chassis, wrapping engines in canvas and straw. Sometimes it worked. Often, it didn't. On the other side of the front, Soviet troops faced their own ordeal. The Red Army's BT and T-26 tanks suffered the same problem, but Soviet engineers had one advantage: experience. They had endured Siberian winters before. They used preheating torches and chemical additives derived from local industry. In Moscow's Technical Institute, NII-5, researchers worked day and night, developing antifreeze mixtures for aircraft fuel and lubricants that remained fluid at -40. The Germans had no such preparations. The logistics system that carried millions of liters of fuel from refineries in Ploiești and Hamburg was built for speed, not adaptation. Engineers in Berlin had warned about temperature effects on synthetic fuel, but their reports were buried under optimism. The Blitzkrieg wasn't supposed to last into winter. By December, reality struck. At a Luftwaffe field near Rzhev, technicians measured the fuel temperature inside storage barrels, -28 degrees. The sample poured like honey. Pilots waiting for takeoff sat in their cockpits, shivering. Missions were canceled one after another. Luftflotte 2 reported, "Operational aircraft reduced by 60% due to technical causes." The High Command demanded answers. The culprit wasn't enemy sabotage. It was chemistry. The synthetic fuels made from coal by the Fischer-Tropsch process contained heavy paraffins. At low temperatures, these paraffins crystallized, blocking filters and carburetors. Every attempt to start an engine pushed the crystals deeper into the lines until nothing moved. Colonel Friedrich Fromm, an engineering officer in charge of fuel logistics, ordered emergency testing. At Königsberg Technical University, chemists under Dr. Hans Trenkler began experiments. They cooled samples of C3 aviation fuel inside glass tubes. By -15, a milky cloud appeared. At -20, the fuel froze solid. Trenkler noted, "It is not ice, it is wax." Wax, the silent enemy in every drop of fuel. Meanwhile, in the field, soldiers invented crude solutions. They mixed alcohol with gasoline, risking engine damage. They stored jerry cans inside tents, next to stoves. Mechanics wrapped fuel pumps with rags soaked in hot water. A few even used Soviet vodka as a thinning agent. These tricks kept a handful of engines alive, but at the cost of power and safety. As winter deepened, the human toll grew. Supply convoys froze on open roads. Aircraft meant for reconnaissance never arrived. Commanders watched as mobility, the essence of blitzkrieg, vanished in white silence. A report from Army Group Center dated January 2, 1942, read, "Fuel supply unreliable. Losses due to freezing exceed enemy action." Inside a small wooden hut near Orel, a group of Luftwaffe engineers gathered around a single kerosene lamp. Among them was Erich Schumann, a physicist temporarily assigned from the Army Weapons Office. He listened to the desperate accounts of frontline mechanics. One question repeated in every letter, every radio call. How do we keep it liquid? Schumann believed the answer wasn't in the field, but in understanding the molecular structure of the fuel itself. The Fischer-Tropsch method, he knew, could produce different chain lengths of hydrocarbons. Shorter chains remained fluid in the cold. But changing production formulas took months, time they didn't have. He wrote in his notes, "If we cannot change the fuel, we must change its environment." That line became the starting point of an improvised campaign that would merge chemistry, engineering, and sheer survival instinct. At night, technicians built makeshift heaters from exhaust pipes and tin cans. They redirected hot air from auxiliary engines toward the fuel tanks. In some airfields, they buried fuel drums underground, where the soil temperature stayed just above freezing. Others experimented with adding low-temperature lubricants, essentially early forms of diesel additives used today. Each method carried risk. Too much heat, and the fuel ignited. Too much additive, and engines lost power. But it was better than nothing. By mid-January, the Luftwaffe managed to restore partial readiness. Out of 300 aircraft grounded by the cold, about 1/3 flew again. Yet the victory was temporary. The next wave of frost dropped temperatures to -40. Once more, engines froze. The pattern repeated like a nightmare. For the men on the ground, it felt like the war itself had frozen solid. As the Eastern Front descended into months of stalemate, Command in Berlin summoned a team of leading chemists and engineers. They were tasked with finding a permanent solution to the fuel crystallization problem. Among them were experts from IG Farben, the conglomerate that produced Germany's synthetic fuels. What they discovered in the following weeks would change the technical course of the war, and later, the entire fuel industry. But for now, on the frozen fields of Russia, mechanics still crawled under silent machines, scraping frost off metal, praying for warmth. The battle wasn't against soldiers anymore. It was against nature itself, and nature was winning. By February 1942, the cold had become part of the landscape, an invisible weapon that fought every engine. German divisions huddled in villages, trying to stay alive while headquarters demanded movement. The phrase fuel starvation began to appear in daily reports. Yet, far from the front, in laboratories and factories, a few engineers believed they could still outthink the winter. In a quiet corner of the IG Farben research facility at Leuna, Dr. Hans Trenkler and his team began running what they called sub-zero flow tests. They used glass coils filled with C3 aviation fuel and placed them inside a refrigerated chamber. A thermometer recorded each drop in temperature. At -15, wax crystals formed. At -25, the fuel stopped moving entirely. Trenkler watched the line of white frost advance through the tube, like a slow death. He understood the chemistry. Synthetic fuel contained long hydrocarbon chains, paraffins, that solidified as wax. To fix it, they needed to break those chains or prevent them from bonding. Trenkler proposed blending small amounts of aromatic hydrocarbons, toluene and xylene, into the mix. These lighter molecules lowered the freezing point. But the problem was supply. Every barrel of toluene was reserved for TNT production, so they turned to something simpler: alcohol. Ethanol and methanol were easy to make from potatoes and wood pulp. The idea was crude, mixing alcohol with fuel to keep it liquid, but the team had data suggesting even 5% could prevent crystallization down to -30. Tränkler sent a coded message to the Luftwaffe Materiel Office. Recommend trial of 5% alcohol admixture in field storage. Observe volatility and ignition delay. Within a week, sealed canisters labeled Versuchsgemisch A, experimental mix A, were shipped east by rail. At the same time, in occupied Poland, a young chemical engineer named Ernst Hagen, stationed at the Luftwaffe's maintenance base near Minsk, received one of those shipments. The barrels arrived crusted with frost. Hagen and his mechanics rolled them inside a hangar lit by kerosene lamps. He recalled later in an interview recorded in the 1950s. "We opened the seal and poured it into a bucket. It smelled sweeter than normal fuel. The men joked that maybe it would burn like schnapps." They filled the tank of a Bf-110 night fighter, connected a manual pump, and waited. The starter whined. The engine coughed once, twice, and caught. The roar filled the hangar. Steam poured from the exhaust. For the first time in weeks, an aircraft ran without a fire under it. The news spread quickly. Mechanics in nearby units tried the same mixture. Success rates rose. But new problems appeared. Alcohol corroded rubber seals and reduced octane rating. Engines knocked violently. A few caught fire in midair. The fix was unstable. Back in Germany, Tränkler's team received the field reports and realized the limits of chemical blending. They needed a mechanical solution, a way to heat the fuel before it reached the engine. That challenge landed on the desk of Heinrich Eberlein, an engineer from Junkers Motorenwerke in Dessau. Eberlein specialized in preheating systems used in diesel locomotives. He suggested adapting exhaust heat exchangers to warm aviation fuel lines. The concept was simple. Redirect part of the engine's hot exhaust gas through a metal jacket surrounding the fuel line, keeping it above 0 degrees Celsius. In February 1942, the first prototype was mounted on a Ju-88 bomber for ground tests. The modification added 5 kilograms of weight, but kept the fuel flowing even when ambient temperature dropped below -30. Test reports described it as rudimentary but promising. Meanwhile, Soviet engineers were tackling the same issue with remarkable improvisation. At the Zavod No. 26 plant in Ufa, technicians introduced kerosene heaters mounted directly beneath aircraft fuel tanks. They also began using an additive known as T1 frost inhibitor, developed by chemists under Professor Alexei Bach at the Academy of Sciences. It contained small amounts of benzene and acetone, substances that disrupted crystal formation without damaging seals. Soviet archival data later showed a 30% increase in cold weather engine starts compared to previous winters. The Germans intercepted these results through intelligence channels and realized they were racing not just against temperature, but against time. In March, at the Luftwaffe Experimental Center in Rechlin, teams conducted comparative trials. One Mi-110 used pure C3 fuel, another used Tränkler's alcohol blend, a third employed Eberlein's heated lines. The ambient temperature in the chamber was set to -35. The pure fuel engine seized after 30 seconds. The alcohol blend ran for 2 minutes before knocking out. The heated line system ran continuously for 15 minutes. It was the first clear victory. But implementation across the front required materials, metal tubing, valves, insulation, that Germany could barely supply. So engineers improvised again. They scavenged from wrecked aircraft, melted down aluminum scrap, even used field kitchen stoves as auxiliary heaters. Oberfeldwebel Kruger, The same mechanic who once wrote, "We were fighting the winter," described the arrival of the new system in his diary. They gave us a drawing on brown paper, how to wrap a pipe around the exhaust. We built it with what we had. The first morning it worked, we cheered like it was a victory. For every working heater, dozens failed. Some overheated and melted the lines, others leaked exhaust into the cockpit. Yet, through thousands of small trials, a pattern emerged. The principle was sound. Warm fuel flowed, cold engines lived. Parallel to these field solutions, IG Farben chemists continued refining the composition of synthetic fuel. By mid-1942, they developed a winter-grade formula called B4W, containing fewer long-chain paraffins and a trace of toluene recovered from refinery waste. The blend reduced gelling temperature to -40. Production began immediately at the Leuna and Pulitz plants. For the first time since the start of Operation Barbarossa, the Luftwaffe regained reliable mobility in winter. Reconnaissance flights resumed. Armored convoys moved again. The change seemed almost miraculous, but it was the product of relentless testing, failure, and adaptation. Yet, behind the numbers lay the human cost. Engineers often worked in unheated workshops, breathing chemical fumes for hours. Several suffered frostbite. A few died from carbon monoxide poisoning while testing heaters in enclosed hangars. None were decorated. Their names rarely appeared in reports. On a cold night near Vršov, Hagen watched a row of bombers take off one by one, their engines glowing orange in the snow. He later wrote to his wife, "The noise tonight was different. It wasn't anger. It was relief. We learned to make the machines breathe again." By spring, when the thaw came, the frozen fuel crisis seemed over. But the lessons would echo far beyond that season. The blend and heating methods pioneered in those desperate months would become standard practice across military and civilian aviation. Even decades later, airlines used additives born in those frozen hangars. Still, in early 1942, victory was far from sight. Germany's eastern armies remained trapped in snow and mud. Supplies dwindled. Fuel quality varied. Engineers kept pushing for better stability, longer storage, higher flash points. For every solution found, another problem emerged. But one thing had changed. They now understood that science, not ideology, would decide who could move and who would remain frozen in place. And somewhere between the frozen airfields and the chemical labs, the foundations of modern cold-weather engineering were quietly being laid. By the winter of 1942, the engineers had learned how to keep the fuel flowing. But the price of that knowledge was measured not only in experiments and reports, it was written in burns, frostbite, and exhaustion. The war machine ran again, yet the people who kept it alive were reaching their limits. In December, temperatures in the Smolensk sector fell below -40. The modified heaters built from scavenged exhaust pipes worked, but they required constant monitoring. One valve left open, and the fumes filled the cockpit. One leak, and the entire aircraft caught fire. Mechanics slept in their uniforms beside the engines, taking turns feeding the makeshift stoves that kept the fuel lines warm through the night. At the Minsk Air Base, Oberfeldwebel Karl-Heinz Kruger, by then a veteran mechanic, recorded a night that stayed with him forever. The thermometer read -41. We had 5 bombers ready for the dawn mission. The heaters worked for 4 of them. On the 5th, the line burst. The explosion took 2 men. We buried them before breakfast. Such incidents were rarely reported to headquarters. The official paperwork simply listed them as technical losses. The Luftwaffe could not afford to admit that its machines were killing their own crews. Meanwhile, the chemists at IG Farben faced another kind of danger. In their rush to produce the new winter-grade fuel, they bypassed safety procedures. Benzene, toluene, methanol, all toxic substances, filled the air in poorly ventilated plants. Workers collapsed from poisoning. Some went blind. Wartime secrecy buried the accidents under numbers and codes. A later report from Luna noted 27 personnel incapacitated due to inhalation of volatile agents. Dr. Hans Trenkler himself was hospitalized for chemical burns after a spill during testing. He returned to work 10 days later, his hands wrapped in gauze. His colleagues joked that he was half man, half filter. But privately, they knew he was pushing beyond reason. The project had become personal. Trenkler wrote in his notes that winter, "We are freezing and burning at the same time. Every discovery begins with someone getting hurt." While engineers suffered in the labs, the frontline mechanics fought a different battle. Supplies of the new B4W winter-grade fuel arrived inconsistently. Some units received barrels labeled as such, but filled with regular summer blend due to logistical confusion. Those mistakes cost lives. Engines seized mid-flight, forcing pilots to crash land in the snow. One of the most tragic incidents occurred on January 8, 1943, when a formation of Heinkel He-111 bombers took off from Orsha for a night raid on Moscow. The temperature was -35. Midway through the climb, 2 planes fell out of formation. Investigators later found waxed fuel in their filters. The barrels loaded before takeoff had been mislabeled. The commander's report concluded coldly, "Material error in logistics chain. Cause, human oversight." But to those who loaded the fuel by torchlight, it wasn't an oversight. It was fatigue. Men had worked for 72 hours straight, fingers cracked, eyes blurred by smoke. The human system was freezing too. Still, the work continued. In Rechlin, Heinrich Eberlein improved his heating system, adding a thermostatic valve to prevent overheating. It worked brilliantly in tests, but mass production required copper tubing and nickel alloys, both scarce due to Allied bombing of factories. Field workshops replaced them with steel and tin, which corroded quickly. Every few weeks the lines had to be rebuilt. The soldiers joked bitterly, "Our engines run on hope, not gasoline." The same pattern haunted the Soviet side. At the Yakovlev plant outside Moscow, female technicians worked through the night mixing antifreeze compounds for Yak-1 fighters. Their fingers turned blue from exposure to chemicals. Many had lost husbands or brothers at the front, but continued their shifts anyway. One worker, Zenaida Krylova, wrote in a letter to her sister, "The smell of fuel is everywhere. When we wash our hands, the water burns. But when we hear an engine start outside, it feels like revenge against the cold." That single line captured the spirit of both sides, the shared humanity behind the machines. In early 1943, as the Battle of Stalingrad drew to its catastrophic end, the frozen fuel crisis intersected with tragedy on a scale no engineer could fix. Entire divisions were trapped without supplies. Fuel lines meant nothing if no fuel arrived at all. When the last German aircraft tried to supply the encircled Sixth Army, half of them never made it back. Icy runways, shattered tires, engines flamed out mid-air, and many crashed during takeoff. A Luftwaffe technical officer, Oberleutnant Wilhelm Stark, later testified, "We had solved the freezing problem, but by then there was nothing left to burn." The bitter irony was clear. Science had caught up, but logistics had failed. Even as Stalingrad fell, research in Germany continued relentlessly. The new B4W formula was improved again, adding naphtha fractions to further reduce crystallization. The work was classified as Kriegswichtig, essential to the war. Dozens of young chemists were drafted from universities to work at IG Farben, many without understanding the risks. In April 1943, a fire broke out in a test hall at Pöhlitz during an experiment on high-temperature cracking. The explosion killed 7 technicians and destroyed months of data. Officially, it was described as an industrial mishap. Unofficially, it was another reminder that innovation during war came with a body count. Meanwhile, on the ground in Russia, soldiers continued to improvise. They used hot sand, torches, and even burning straw to thaw lines. One field engineer near Rzhev designed a hand-cranked pump powered by bicycle gears to circulate warm oil through engines overnight. It saved lives, but he died weeks later from pneumonia. When spring finally came, melting the snow into rivers of mud, the relief was mixed with exhaustion. Mechanics looked at the thawing airfields and said quietly, "At least the machines will die warm." By mid-1943, both sides had implemented standardized cold weather procedures. Soviet manuals instructed ground crews to preheat engines for no less than 40 minutes and store aircraft facing east to catch morning sun. German directives ordered the use of heated hangars wherever possible and mandatory inspection of exhaust heater systems after every 10 hours of operation. The crisis, for the moment, was contained. But its cost remained invisible, etched into the lungs of workers, the nerves of mechanics, and the hands of those who never stopped turning wrenches in the snow. Years later, when survivors of those units met after the war, they spoke little of strategy or ideology. They remembered the nights when steel cracked and engines groaned like dying animals. They remembered the smell of methanol and the glow of heaters against the ice. Ernst Hagen, now an old man in the 1960s, summarized it best during a rare interview. "People think we fought the Soviets, but we fought the cold. The Soviets just learned how to live with it sooner." He looked at the reporter, smiled faintly, and added, "Every war has its scientists. Ours just froze faster." Those who studied the wartime records later agreed. The frozen fuel crisis was one of the least known, yet most defining technical battles of the Eastern Front. It revealed not just the limits of machinery, but the endurance of the humans who kept it alive. And while generals moved pins on maps, somewhere out there, a mechanic stood over a glowing pipe in the dark, holding a spanner with bare hands, and whispered a prayer, not for victory, but for ignition. When the war ended in May 1945, Europe thawed, but the lessons of its coldest winters did not melt away. Across destroyed airfields and factories, engineers carried notebooks filled with sketches, chemical ratios, and handwritten formulas for keeping machines alive in freezing weather. Those papers would shape the technology of the next generation. At Leuna and Pölitz, the once secret laboratories of IG Farben were stripped bare by Allied investigators. Among the confiscated documents were reports marked Winter Betriebsstoff, Streng Geheim, Winter Operational Fuel, Top Secret. They contained detailed studies of fuel crystallization curves, alcohol additives, and preheating systems. To the Americans and British engineers who examined them, these papers were gold. The Cold War was beginning, and both sides would soon face new frontiers of ice and altitude. In one file, a handwritten note by Dr. Hans Trenkler read, "At -40 degrees, paraffins form crystals shaped like snowflakes. They must be taught to forget." The phrase struck a U.S. Army chemist as poetic but precise. Within a few years, the concept evolved into what we now call pour-point depressants, chemical additives that prevent fuel gelling in diesel engines and jet turbines. At the same time, the Soviet Union, drawing on its own wartime research, developed low-temperature fuels for aircraft like the MiG-15 and for tanks deployed in Siberia. Their scientists cited the work of Professor Alexei Bach and the antifreeze compounds first tested during the defense of Moscow. The frozen fuel crisis of 1941 had become the foundation of modern cold weather engineering. But in 1945, few remembered the names of the men and women who started it. Ernst Hagen returned to civilian life in Hamburg, working for a small chemical firm. His wartime journals, filled with meticulous notes on field improvisations, were later used by German industry during Reconstruction. He never claimed credit. "We were mechanics, not inventors," he once said. "We just refused to let the machines die before we did." Dr. Trenkler was arrested by Allied authorities for his work with IG Farben, but released a year later when investigators realized his research had no direct link to weapons production. He joined a post-war consortium studying petroleum chemistry in Stuttgart. He died quietly in 1961, his notebooks still stained with the smell of methanol. Heinrich Eberlein, the engineer behind the exhaust heating system, was recruited to Britain under Operation Surgeon, a program that brought German scientists to assist in post-war aviation research. His designs were later refined into automatic fuel heating units used in early jet engines such as the Rolls-Royce Avon. And somewhere in Russia, Zinaida Krylova, the factory worker who once mixed antifreeze with bare hands, was honored by her plant's management in 1946 for labor heroism. Her story was published briefly in a local newspaper, then forgotten. For the men who fought the cold, the end of war felt anticlimactic. There were no medals for solving chemistry problems, yet their work had done what armies could not. It turned winter into an ally. By the 1950s, airlines across Europe began adopting similar principles. Ground crews preheated fuel before refueling aircraft. Storage tanks were insulated, and chemical anti-gelling agents became standard in both aviation and automotive fuels. The diesel additive industry, worth billions today, owes its origin to those desperate months on the Eastern Front. Even space exploration inherited those lessons. When the Soviet R-7 rocket, ancestor of the Soyuz, was designed to launch from frozen Kazakh steppes, engineers used cryogenic insulation and fuel conditioning techniques first derived from wartime experiments. The war's frozen misery had quietly transformed into the technology of the space age. But memory is selective. The official histories of World War II celebrated generals and tacticians, not engineers shivering beside leaking pipes. The Battle of the Frozen Fuel Lines was rarely mentioned in textbooks. It survived only in fragments, letters, diaries, and dusty engineering reports stamped Geheim. One such letter, found decades later in an archive in Leipzig, was written by Trenkler to his wife during the winter of 1942. It ended with a line that captured both despair and purpose. "If one day they build machines that never freeze, let them know it began here, in the snow, with our breath turning to ice." The sentiment echoed through time. When British engineer Frank Whittle developed cold-weather fuel systems for jet engines in the late 1940s, he acknowledged valuable data derived from continental wartime research. American aviation manuals of the 1950s contained graphs that matched, almost exactly, the curves plotted by German chemists under the flicker of kerosene lamps. The lessons had crossed borders, cleansed of ideology but carrying the fingerprints of those who learned them the hard way. Today, when aircraft refuel in Alaska or Siberia, sensors automatically regulate the temperature of kerosene. Every pipeline has a heating circuit. Every fuel blend has an additive precisely calculated to prevent gelling. Few realize that these quiet, invisible safeguards were born from the chaos of 1941. It is the paradox of war. Progress often comes from desperation, and innovation from suffering. On modern airfields, ground crews still perform a small ritual inherited from those times. They check the viscosity of fuel samples against the light, looking for that first trace of cloudiness. When it appears, they know it's time to adjust the mix. It's a gesture older than the jet age, older than victory itself. If you look closely at old photographs from the Eastern Front, black and white images of men crouched under wings, fires burning beneath engines. You can almost hear the silence after the ignition, the moment when frost gave way to flame. They weren't chasing glory. They were chasing warmth. And in that fragile moment, when an engine finally roared to life under a sky full of snow, they proved something greater than technology. That even in the coldest corners of history, persistence can burn hotter than war itself.